consultant, Blackhat, a true Blackhat hacker on FBI's most wanted list that actually served 5 years in prison. He did all kinds of things. He even hacked into radio contests at KISS FM to win a Porsche, I believe. And the FBI and LAPD databases to change his physical description, which is actually quite nice. Now he's an editor at Wired, so that's really interesting. Co-author of Kingpin, biography of the former Blackhat hacker Max Vision. And another fascinating human being sitting next to me here is Chris McKinlay, mathematician, activist, PhD in math from UCLA. Has an advanced degree also from Harbin, which is like China's MIT, and speaks perfect Mandarin. He actually hacked into OkCupid dating site, and that's where he met his current girlfriend. So, and apparently, when he was in college, he paid for his grad school counting cards in Vegas. So we have three very, very, very interesting people here that have collaborated with Michael Mann on Blackhat.
So I was an FBI agent for 10 years. I was a supervisor in the cyber division at FBI headquarters, and I led what we call fly teams that would go to the most serious computer intrusions across the country and investigate them. Mostly, you know, doing what we would call digital forensics. And, you know, an interesting point to note about that is that, you know, computer data is very ephemeral, and so getting there quickly and being able to get the data and analyze it quickly is paramount. So I've been doing that for about 15 years now.
I began hacking when I was, I think, 15 or 16 years old. And initially I was hacking the ARPANET, which is the forerunner of what we today call the internet. Later on I moved on to the phone company. For a time I was a fugitive from guys like this. I was not on the 10 most wanted list. I never made that. During that time, I made a living by cheating at radio station phone-in contests, as mentioned. I won a Porsche and some cash prizes, and then eventually I was turned in. After serving some time in jail, I went on to become a journalist and an author, which is what I've been doing now for about 15 or 16 years.
Yeah, like Kevin, I got started pretty early hacking on networks, and did a bunch of stuff with Anonymous starting around 2010, and got connected with Michael Mann because of the work I did on OkCupid. So I was able to make myself into the most popular male profile on the site in Los Angeles. And met a lot of people that way, and ended up meeting my fiance that way. Well, on that particular website, it's having the highest match percentage with the most people. So it's not unlike upping your page rank, you know, in a Google search.
So in my case, Michael approached me for two things, I think. One was technical advice. He had a screenplay, and he wanted to make it as authentic as he could without sacrificing the drama. So part of what I did was going over that with him, effectively line by line, and making some suggestions. Then he was also very interested in the psychology of hacking, why people do it, what it's like being a hacker in prison, so we talked about that a lot. The problem of how to do a movie where people are doing things behind a keyboard and keep it exciting, Michael mostly solved, I think, through his own skill at that kind of thing, and there are lots of explosions and car chases and drama and intrigue that take place away from the keyboard.
Yeah, just to add to that, he's very concerned with authenticity. And maintaining as much authenticity as possible. And so that presented a lot of challenges when it came to trying to keep scenes tight dramatically and so forth. And so there were a few scenes that you know, started off, I think, as software only, and ended up involving, you know, people physically ripping things out of sockets of various sorts. And there were a lot of creative solutions, I think, passed around to various problems like that one.
Most of our interaction was around the investigation of the crimes that are occurring in the movie, and we had a lot of long conversations about just that. Is how do we make this Someone sitting behind a keyboard, how do we make that visual? How do we make that exciting? And a lot of long conversations about how to make that work.
I think it's extremely authentic. You know, the initial conceit for the movie was the Stuxnet virus, which is a virus that infected and caused destruction of nuclear enrichment facilities in Iran. So you know, this stuff is very much happening, and you know, I think from the initial conceit all the way through to the final film, there's been extreme amount of attention paid to detail and the plot and the dialogue and the code that goes on screen. I know because I wrote most of it. You know, the set, all of this has been very carefully constructed.
It really captures the international flavor of cybercrime in a way that no other movie that I've seen has captured. That I think is one of the biggest things that it brings to the table as far as, you know, advancing this type of film.
I think the film is very prescient. You know, in the year or so that it's been in post-production, I mean, we've seen some of these things that are depicted in the film happening in real life. So I mean, I think it's very realistic.
Yeah, there was just recently an incident where a nuclear power plant in South Korea was attacked by hackers, and they didn't get into anything where they could physically damage the plant, but they stole secrets and blueprints and that sort of thing. And then there was a case just recently in Germany where hackers got into a steel forge and got into the control systems there and actually damaged the plant so that it had to be shut down. So yeah, it's kind of getting, as Robert said, as Michael said, it's prescient. I gave Chris Hemsworth some fashion tips. Aside from that, no.
Absolutely, yeah. Spent a lot of time working with the principal actors, teaching them, you know, everything from what does a hacker sound like when they talk? What does it sound like when you're typing code as opposed to typing English text? You know, how do you interact with a terminal? Lots of stuff, minute details.
It doesn't happen so much, no. The government is good now at growing its own hackers. What you do see are hackers who become informants, and they'll continue to work for the government in some capacity, providing information about other hackers.
That's right. It's not uncommon in the course of an investigation for someone to be what they call flipped, and that person provides information on the other co-conspirators. That's always going to be a linchpin of any investigation, good investigation. I think the motivations are as varied as the individuals at this point. I mean, I think in the early days, a lot of it was motivated by pride and by, you know, originally the word hacker was not meant to be pejorative. It was someone who made software or hardware do things that were unexpected or what it wasn't intended to do. And then as time has gone on, people realized that they could use those skills for financial gain in the criminal world. And now we're even seeing things like, or we've been seeing for a long time, what we would call hacktivism, which is, you know, things like Anonymous or Lulzsec, where they attacks websites or organizations for political reasons.
Yeah, the biggest overall shift is recreational intrusion has really subsided. It's kind of in the background now, and we have serious for-profit intrusions absolutely dominating as far as computer hacking goes. So you have entire gangs in Russia and Ukraine primarily who specialize in stealing credit card numbers and siphoning money from bank accounts. And they're very, very professional, and they make millions and millions of dollars at it every year.
I think the other big change is the way that responses are crafted to these incidents and the way that they're publicized. You know, in the early 90s, there weren't many laws on the books about, you know, what constitutes a crime and how to prosecute it. And nowadays, you see people getting put away for 10, 12 years for participating in a distributed denial of service attack that, you know, the British government will unleash, you know, at will against private companies, individuals, IRC networks. So that's very much in flux. I mean, I think even classic hacks can be extremely effective, like the phishing attack you mentioned. I mean, the fact that the email comes from his supervisor and is referencing information in a conversation he definitely had, those kinds of cons can be especially effective. You know, if Amazon writes you an email and says, your account was recently hacked, you need to change your password, you're a little more susceptible to it than if you get some random email from a supposed general in Nigeria, right? It's all about confidence. Yeah, absolutely. As Michael was saying, the term hack was originally a sort of laudatory thing. To hack on something was to work on it creatively and to come up with good solutions to problems. So the term hackathon is very much in that spirit. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good work is coming out of hackathons, and that's a very different kind of hacking. Like what it has in common, some of the drive and creativity of the type of hacking we've been talking about, but it without the criminal element. I think attacks like the Sony attack are really the future of intergovernmental conflict. Where we've seen a few examples now. Sony is probably the biggest, but we've seen a few examples where somebody comes in and they devote themselves utterly to destroying an organization or a corporation, or coming as close to that as they can. And it's just wiping disks and leaking secrets, and no profit motive and no fun. It's not a recreational hack, and that's probably one of the biggest dangers that we're facing now in computer crime, and it's only going to get worse.
One of the themes of the movie, I think, is asymmetry. It's the fact that, this asymmetric warfare, which is that, a single person with a laptop can take down a nuclear reactor, and can take down, can launch an attack on a nation state, just because of the interconnectedness of data. And this is exactly, the sort of thing that we're seeing come to fruition. We have potentially, I don't think that this is attributed yet, but if it is in fact true that North Korea attacked a corporation, then that is certainly an example of asymmetry, a nation state attacking a corporation. So the world is definitely changing.
Attribution in these incidents is also extremely complicated. And I think the movie does a great job of dramatizing that. It's often very difficult to be sure about who did what, when, what combination of people or groups of people did what. And that's also true in the case of Sony. Sony has a lot of enemies and a lot of people who would profit. There's evidence that the people who attacked it were in there for quite a while. There's less evidence that North Korea on its own has those kinds of capabilities. So these things are, I think, always more complicated than what you hear in sound bites. Okay. I think for the most part, prevention, there are a set of information security controls that should be applied to any network to secure it. I think one of the main things that is happening as we move forward into the future is the ability for entities to react quickly. I mean, I think that there's some understanding that we live in a little bit of a vulnerable world, and due to the complexity of code and all these systems that we have, there's always going to be vulnerabilities, and that a persistent advanced hacker can get in. And so a lot of the focus recently has been on how do we respond quickly and get them out, and about resiliency of the networks, and a lot of the things that are going on in computing in terms of cloud computing and virtualization and those sorts of things allow us to be more resilient and return to a known good default state after an attack has occurred. I don't think so. I'd love to hear from these guys, but I don't think so. I think, again, any determined actor with enough time and enough resources can probably find a way in. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Linux kernel, which is the center of the Linux operating system, is over 18 million lines of code now. It's way too big for any one person to fully understand from top to bottom, and most operating systems are like that. The complexity is very large, and more so than preventing gaps, I think, is changing the culture so that more people, more sets of eyes are looking at these critical pieces of code. Prevent things like heartbleed, for example.
Right. A lot of the most serious work these days is done in getting the ability to detect when you've been hacked, and stop the hackers from acquiring what they're trying to acquire or do what they're trying to do. So it's more of a defense in depth approach, instead of saying, I'm just going to keep everybody out. you accept you're not going to keep everybody out and come up with a way to make sure that you find them when they get
That
out.
happens all the time. Well, I think, as Kevin was saying, it's a matter of how quickly they react and get those people out of the network and not allow them to get to the stuff that is really important.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's using the same collection of software components, and these components all have holes. So, if you're just looking for a hole, you can find it. If you're focused on one particular company, that ups the game a little bit, right? Because you have to deal with what they're working with. But it's still, eminently doable. It's just a question of how many, resources.
Yeah, and the thing about a large organization is all you have to do is find one person who will click on a link that they shouldn't click on, and you're in. And that's how most of these intrusions begin these days. It's exactly like the scenario Chris came up with, where you get a phishing email. It's targeted right at you. Somebody's going to fall for it if you send it to enough people.
John, the special effects supervisor, was the main guy in charge of that. And I can say that John himself is a big Unix geek, and I think he really relished the challenge of trying to depict, how information travels through a computer. And he was able to get very detailed physical models from hardware, motherboard, chip providers down to the micron level. And so, the way that the bits in these packets are lit is largely for dramatic effect, but the actual passage of information through hardware is about as close to realistic, I think, as you could expect.
So how do you hack?
We're going to be here a long time.
If someone asked you, what is hacking and how do you do it?
It's essentially writing code, I guess scripting. So, using pieces of software that were developed to iterate quickly, get feedback quickly from the machine you're trying to talk to or get a way into.
Yeah, and as a practical matter, it's usually, at least at the outset, a combination of a con of some sort of social engineering element, and a technical attack. So it's kind of like it's kind of like putting together a caper. There are a few moving parts, and you're trying to arrange them in a way that everything comes out just right for you as the attacker. That's one of the things that makes it fun.
Mike, anything you'd like to add?
I think it has a pattern to it that most hackers who do it professionally, whether they be pen testers or criminals, is there's sort of a reconnaissance of the target, and then there's a probing of the weak spots, as Chris was mentioning earlier, and then there's a finding of some sort of vulnerability, and then an exploitation of that vulnerability, and then once they're inside the network, then that's when it gets really tricky to find them, because then they start impersonating users within the network and start moving around the network laterally. And so in general, that's what a hack is. But I think the things that really interests people, though, is sort of the exploitation phase, which is about running code that you wrote on someone else's system. And that's what Chris was saying.
Yeah. For sake of concreteness, I'd maybe point you at a company called Mandiant, which has done a pretty in-depth study of the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army, who do a lot of penetration in America. American companies, oftentimes industrial contractors like Lockheed Martin. They'll find out companies that serve Lockheed Martin, do a lot of business with them. Maybe there's a company that does a lot of HR for Lockheed, and they'll get into that company first. And they'll get into the email of the people who send a lot of email to Lockheed Martin, right? And then they'll put booby-trapped PDFs into attachments from people that you get mail from all the time. And in general, like Kevin was saying, the weakest part of any system is the human part, So that's typically the way that they do.
So I guess I'll start with that one. It's a great question. And it is a combination, and as depicted in the movie, it is a combination of technical and the human element. And as Kevin can probably elaborate, and we were talking a little bit about it before we started, is there's still some traditional investigative steps that are required. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times you take the technical aspects, and you're gathering evidence, and then you try to find yourself a subject, and then that person, when you get them into an interview room, and then you're having a discussion with them about these alleged activities, that's where the human element comes in. So it really is a combination of both logical and technical and creative. Sort of a general answer to that.
Yeah, the human element really trips up hackers, the sophisticated ones more often than not. The guy I wrote the book about, he was a serious black hat hacker who ran a criminal organization. He operated from a safe house, a rented safe house in San Francisco. He only used hacked Wi-Fi to do his hacks. He had multiple layers of technical security around him. But he had to work with people. He was part of an organization. And eventually some of those people started getting busted, and they told what they knew about him to the FBI, and the FBI and the Secret Service eventually built up enough information that they could figure out who he was in real life. And as soon as they come through the door with the battering rams, all the technical surveillance, all the technical countermeasures doesn't help you anymore.
Anything you want to add, Chris?
Yeah, I would add that this is all true, and it sounds pretty scary, I think, and it is pretty scary. But the thing that scares me the most is honestly the government response to a lot of these actions, especially actions that essentially amount to small pieces of vandalism by kids. I don't think this is an excuse for the FBI to arm itself, with NSA-like capabilities to, indict anyone, anywhere, arrest anyone, anywhere, look at anyone, anywhere. And honestly, the most frightening concentrations of power I see right now are not in black hat hackers or foreign states. It's in the NSA and the FBI.